Chapter 30 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cole McKinnon. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 30. The longest of her life was that day to June. The anxiety in times of war for the women who wait at home is vague because they are mercifully ignorant of the dangers their loved ones run, but a specific issue that involves death to those loved ones has a special and poignant terror of its own. June knew her father's plan, the precise time the fight would take place, and the especial danger that was Hale's, for she knew that young Dave Tolliver had marked him with the first shot fired. Dry-eyed and white and dumb, she watched them make ready for the start that morning while it was yet dark. Dully she heard the horses snorting from the cold, the low court orders of her father, and the exciting mutterings of Bub and young Dave. Dully she watched the saddles thrown on, the pistols buckled, the Winchesters caught up, and dully she watched them file out the gate and ride away, single file, into the cold damp mist, like ghostly figures in a dream. Once only did she open her lips, and that was to plead with her father to leave Bub at home, but her father gave her no answer, and Bub snorted his indignation. He was a man now, and his was the privilege of a man. For a while she stood listening to the ring of metal against stone that came to her more and more faintly out of the mist, and she wondered if it was really June Tolliver standing there, while father and brother and cousin were on their way to fight the law. How differently she saw these things now. For a man who deserved death, and to fight a man who was ready to die for his duty to that law, the law that guarded them and her might not perhaps guard him, the man who had planted for her the dew-drenched garden that was waiting for the sun, and had built the little room behind her for her comfort and seclusion, who had sent her to school, had never been anything but kind and just to her and to everybody, who had taught her life and, thank God, love. Was she really the June Tolliver who had gone out into the world and had held her place there, who had conquered birth and speech and customs and environment so that none could tell what they all once were, who had become a lady, the woman of the world, in manner, dress, and education, who had a gift of music and voice that might enrich her life beyond any dream that had ever sprung from her own brain or any that she had ever caught from Hale's? Was she June Tolliver who had been and done all that, and now had come back and was slowly sinking back into the narrow grave from which Hale had lifted her? It was all too strange and bitter, but if she wanted proof, there was her stepmother's voice now, the same old querulous, nerve-racking voice that had embittered her all her childhood, calling her down into the old mean round of drudgery that had bound forever the horizon of her narrow life, just as it now was shutting down like a sky of brass around her own. And when the voice came, instead of bursting into tears as she was about to do, she gave a hard little laugh, and she lifted a defiant face to the rising sun. There was a limit to the sacrifice for kindred, brother, father, home, and that limit was the eternal sacrifice, the eternal undoing of herself. When this wretched, terrible business was over, she would set her feet where that sun could rise on her, busy with the work that she could do in the world for which she felt she was born. Swiftly she did the morning chores, and then she sat on the porch thinking and waiting. Spinning wheel, loom, and darning needle were to lie idle that day. The old stepmother had gotten from bed and was dressing herself, miraculously cured of a sudden, miraculously active. She began to talk of what she needed in town, and June said nothing. She went out to the stable and led out the old sorrel mare. She was going to the hanging. "Don't you want to go to town, June?" "No," said June fiercely. "Well, you needn't get mad about it. I got to go some day this week, and I reckon I might as well go terday." June answered nothing, but in silence watched her get ready, and in silence watched her ride away. She was glad to be left alone. The sun had flooded Lonesome Cove now with a light as rich and yellow as though it were late afternoon, and she could yet tell every tree by the different color of the banner that each yet definitely flung into the face of death. The yard fence was festooned with dewy cobwebs, and every weed in the field was hung with them, as with flashing jewels of exquisitely delicate design. Hale had once told her that they meant rain. Far away the mountains were overhung with purple so deep that the very air looked like mist, and a peace that seemed mother-like in tenderness brooded over the earth. Peace! Peace with a man on his way to the scaffold only a few miles away, and two bodies of men, one led by her father, the other by the man she loved, ready to fly at each other's throats, the one to get the condemned man alive, the other to see that he died. She got up with a groan. She walked into the garden. The grass was tall, tangled and withering, and in it dead leaves lay everywhere, stems up, stems down, in reckless confusion. The scarlet sage pods were brown and seeds were drooping from their tiny gaping mouths. The marigolds were frost-nipped, and one lonely black-winged butterfly was vainly searching them one by one for the lost sweets of summer. The gorgeous crowns of the sunflowers were nothing but grotesque black mummy heads set on lean dead bodies, and the clump of big castor plants, buffeted by the wind, leaned this way and that like giants in a drunken orgy trying to keep one another from falling down. The blight that was on the garden was the blight that was in her heart, and two bits of cheer only she found: one yellow nasturtium, scarlet flecked, whose fragrance was a memory of the spring that was long gone, and one little cedar tree that had caught some dead leaves in its green arms was firmly holding them, as though to promise that another spring would surely come. With the flower in her hand she started up the ravine to her dreaming place, but it was so lonely up there, and she turned back. She went into her room and tried to read. Mechanically she half opened the lid of the piano and shut it, horrified by her own act. As she passed out on the porch again she noticed it was only 9 o'clock. She turned and watched the long hand. How long a minute was! 3 hours more! She shivered and went inside and got her bonnet. She could not be alone when the hour came, and she started down the road toward Uncle Billy's mill. Hale! 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 The name began to ring in her ears like a bell. The little shacks he had built up the creek were deserted and gone to ruin, and she began to wonder, in the light of what her father had said, how much of a tragedy that meant to him. Here was the spot where he was fishing that day when she had slipped down behind him and he had turned and seen her for the first time. She could recall his smile and the very tone of his kind voice. "Howdy, little girl," and the cat had got her tongue. She remembered when she had written her name after she had first kissed him at the foot of the beech, June Hale, and by a grotesque mental leap the beating of his name in her brain now made her think of the beating of hailstone on her father's roof one night when as a child she had lain and listened to them. Then she noticed that the autumn shadows seemed to make the river darker than the shadows of spring, or was it already the stain of dead leaves? Hale could have told her. Those leaves were floating through the shadows, and when the wind moved, others zigzagged softly down to join them. The wind was helping them on the water too, and along came one brown leaf that was shaped like a tiny trireme, its stem acting like a rudder and keeping it straight before the breeze, so that it swept past the rest as a yacht that she was once on had swept past a fleet of fishing sloops. She was not unlike that swift little ship, and 30 yards ahead were rocks and shallows where it and the whole fleet would turn topsy-turvy. Would her own triumph be as short, and the same fate be hers? There was no question as to that, unless she took the wheel of her fate in her own hands and with them steered the ship. Thinking hard, she walked on slowly, with her hands behind her and her eyes bent on the road. What should she do? She had no money, her father had none to spare, and she could accept no more from Hale. Once she stopped and stared with unseeing eyes at the blue sky, and once under the heavy helplessness of it all, she dropped on the side of the road and sat with her head buried in her arms. Sat so long that she rose with a start and, with an apprehensive look at the mountain sun, hurried on. She would go to the Gap and teach, and then she knew that if she went there it would be on Hale's account. Very well, she would not blind herself to that fact. She would go, and perhaps all would be made up between them, and then she knew that if that but happened, nothing else could